Hello design students. In this video I'm going to go over the principle of space in surface design or 2D design. So when you look at space, you can look at a lot of different things when it comes to surface design. And I've kind of like categorized them into three different things. And they're quite different from each other in this case. So the first thing that we're going to be looking at is positive negative space. Sometimes it's also known as figure ground. And what that really means is that the positive space is what you are seeing as objects on a piece of paper or a textile or something. And the negative space is the space around that object that really allows you to see that object in different ways. It can either be in a contrast way, or it maybe blends in a little bit more, something like that. And all that has to do with like what's going on that surface. The second topic we will discuss is grouping. And what that means is there's different ways of grouping objects together that will make you see certain objects as to have a relationship with each other. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is creating the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. All right, so we're going to start with figure ground or positive and negative space. So this artist created the alphabet out of photographs, as you can see, and he really utilized negative space, which is space around a particular object, and used that to carve out the photographs to create the letters. Okay, so you can see I've used the red marker to kind of like highlight the letter M here, but it's really about what the artist cut out in that photograph around. And then he also kind of followed what was in the photograph a little bit. I believe this looks like a woman's photo, and he kind of like cut where the clothes kind of fold and things like that to create that letter M. And then here is where he has created all the letters of the alphabet. So if you remember, like, you know, when we were kids, sometimes you would see images that, you know, some people see the vase or some people see two people. That also kind of falls into positive and negative space. So I definitely think you should do a little bit more research and find some examples on that. Okay. The second thing we're going to be looking at is grouping, and this has been further sectioned off into 6 topics. Now, a lot of times they overlap, but we're going to try to focus on these 6 topics when it comes to grouping. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly read through these and then show you some examples. The first one is called good figure, objects that are grouped together. And sometimes are tend to be perceived as a single figure. So for example, we have 16 circles here, but what we're seeing is this diamond shape because of the way that they are grouped together. Similarity is that objects that are similar to each other, we kind of group them in our heads. So for example, we have these triangles instead of these circles, so our brain groups this together as like one line, for example. Closure is when we see kind of like a visual connection that's not actually there. So we have these 4 circles that have been cut out and placed in a way where what we see is a square in the middle. And that's what we're actually seeing. So really it's about like placing objects, cutting objects in a way that visually manipulates the viewer. Proximity grouping objects by spacing them next to each other. So things that are grouped together, we read this as one object, and then we read this as one object because it's separated by a little space. Okay. This one's kind of interesting, continuation. So what we see here is an X, but it's actually just two lines intersecting each other, right? Because they're the same kind of line. We start to see this as an X versus two lines. And then symmetry, whenever we use symmetry like bilateral symmetry or radial symmetry, it creates new shapes for us, right? So instead of this being a bunch of circles, we kind of see this as like a diamond or a triangular shape with like a shape in the middle. Okay, so again, it's all about manipulating what the viewer is seeing by placement. Okay, so this is just an example that I have that shows three of those types of grouping. So good figure, again, is when you're putting objects next to each other to create a new object. So we placed, so this artist placed 5 squares together to create this object. Things that are similar to each other, we tend to group them together. So a really good example of that is just text. So when we look at text, what we're doing is we're not looking at these letters as like separate objects, right? We see them as continuous words, and we see this as a sentence because this all looks the same. And then we'll see this, I know this is a different language, but you kind of get the understanding that this might be one sentence, and then this on the bottom, because it's so much smaller, might be something that you read together. Okay, and then we have symmetry, where we have this text in the middle, and then we have these like two groups of figures next to each other. So we kind of try to read this whole thing as one because it's using that bilateral symmetry. So we see that connection there. Here is some more. We see closure here. So this is, if you kind of step back a little bit, you will see that this says The Grammar of Ornament. So this is a book cover designed by Owen Jones. And this is quite popular. This was quite popular back in the day, where a bunch of designs and objects make letters, right? So the letter T is quite huge on this, and it's made out of a lot of different patterns and botanical kind of things. And because they are related to each other, they're on top of each other, next to each other, they're creating this letter that we see as a letter T. Okay. Continuation, we see that in this letter O, right? We see a lot of tiny different objects creating this motion of the letter O. And then proximity is also related to a lot of other sections of grouping. So things that are close together, we read that as one thing. So the letter G we have, and then the word grammar. Even though they look different, they are positioned in a way that we read this as grammar. Okay. Now, I'm not going to say this is that fast to read, because our brain does have to kind of work a little hard to figure out how to read this, but eventually we kind of get there. Okay. All right, and the last one we're going to be focusing on is creating that three-dimensional illusion of space that many artists use. And, you know, this is something that you can really go into if you take a drawing class or a painting class. But we're just going to look at this in kind of an introductory way since we're just talking about 2D design. Okay, so as you can see, this is a poster, and it almost looks kind of like a collage. and the way that the buildings are in the background, the way this woman is falling, and this kind of spiral-like thing created, it almost makes us feel like she is falling through this three-dimensional space. But, of course, it's printed on a single piece of paper and is actually not three-dimensional. So how do artists do that? Okay, so this is a great example that highlights all of these ways that three-dimensional, the illusion of three dimension is created on a single piece of art, on a 2D piece of art. Okay, so we're gonna look at all of these as something that I'm gonna point out in this particular image here by DC Comics. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is size. One way of creating the illusion of three-dimensionality is that objects that are closer to us are going to appear to be larger than objects that are further away. So as you see, you know, the three characters here, they're really big because that they're really close to our face. That's how it feels, right? And then the buildings, the buildings that are closer to us are larger, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller as they go into the background. Overlapping. So of course, that's an easy way of creating 3D illusion. Things that are closer to us are overlapped in the front, and things that are further away are kind of hidden behind those objects that are close to us. Position, okay? A lot of times, not 100% of the time, but most of the time when you take like a photograph or draw an image, things that are closer to us, all of these buildings, are going to be more at the bottom of the page, and things that are further away, like the far end of the buildings and the sky, are going to be on top of the page, okay? So the lower you position something, the closer it appears to be. Perspective. This is a little bit more detailed, so I definitely want you guys to do a little bit of study on perspective. Perspective is basically created out of a focal point, or two focal points sometimes when it's 2-point perspective. This is a 1-point perspective, and a bunch of lines. So if you start to create lines radiating out, you'll see that it matches up with the lines of this buildings going all around. So it kind of like creates like this illusion that you are falling into space, or that you're looking through a large viewpoint into space. Okay, so that's perspective. So I do encourage you guys to look into 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective, 3-point perspective, and that's kind of where it stops. And there are several things that you can look at on YouTube, or even in your book, books about design that can tell you a little bit more about perspective and how to do perspective. It could really be like it's a whole another thing. Then we have an atmospheric perspective. Basically, I've circled 2 places here. So something that is close to us, this building down here, and then something that's really far is the group of buildings back there. What atmospheric perspective does is that, and then this right here, right? Things that are really close to us are going to be shown in greater detail. So if you look at the face of Superman, for example, you see all different kinds of lines. You see all of this detail in the hair and the face and the costume. You see all these shadows. You see all these tiny little lines. Even this building here that's really close to us, you see all of the little stuff that's going on the rooftop, the, you know, AC condenser and all this kind of other mechanical stuff. But if you look at stuff that's kind of far away, it's a little bit more faded because it's far away. It definitely has a very low amount of detail. if you look at the buildings that are like way, way, way in the back, it's really just outlines. And the closer you get, the more detail that you get, and the more in depth that drawing is going to be. Foreshortening is kind of an interesting one. Basically, when you look at Superman here, for example, and foreshortening is really common when used in characters or like animals and things like that may be positioned in a way that it's not just like top to bottom. So the way that Superman is positioned is that he's kind of like coming at you, right? The fist here is almost as large as his head. That's not how it is in real life, but it's really close to us, so it appears to be really big. The head is a little bit smaller than comparatively, and then you see the rest of the body. Because it's like going back in space, it's smaller and shorter than the head and the fist. Okay, so again, like if you look at human proportions, this is not the actual human proportion, right? The fist is not the same size as the head, and it's not just like slightly smaller than the body. The body usually takes up a large space. But because of the positioning of Superman, the way he is shown to be three-dimensional, and he's kind of like flying straight at you, the artist uses and kind of changes all of these proportions, the body proportions, to create that illusion that he is coming through space and not just on a flat piece of paper. And then the last one is quite the most common one, is creating light and shadow. Okay, so it's really important a lot of times to add a light source. So if you look at these buildings, for example, let's just look at this group of buildings here. We have light shining on this side, but it's darker on this side, right? So we can see that the light is kind of like shining from the middle. It's almost like the viewer is the light that is shining on the rest of this image. So you see highlights on the face, on top of the hand, on the body, and then you see like dark shadows around, right? You see a lot of like black shadows to kind of show that like contrast. You also see like dark colored shadows, like this blue shoulder, for example, has a light part and a dark part and like a really inked in part with these little lines. So utilizing light and shadow and how you show that in a piece of artwork can really create three-dimensionality when it comes to the scene that you're creating. Okay, it's really important to imagine where the light is shining from. Start with just one light, one direction, but you can make it more complicated if you have multiple sources of light. Okay, so remember all of these things: size, overlapping, position, perspective, atmospheric perspective, foreshortening, and use of light and shadow. I would say using size, overlapping, positioning, and light and shadow are probably something that you have to use when you're creating that 3D illusion, and then to make it even more, really kind of like drive that idea in, use perspective, atmospheric perspective, and foreshortening. Alrighty, so let me know if you have any questions, and good luck.